There is a version of Yosemite that exists in photographs. You have seen it. Everyone has. The flat granite face of El Capitan catches the morning light. The falls are white and vertical against the grey cliffs. The valley floor in early June, when the meadows are still green, and the sky is that particular shade of blue that makes people drive 17 hours to stand in one spot and breathe. I believed in that version. I believed in it the way you believe in a place you've studied without visiting with confidence and zero weight. I had read the literature, I had completed the training modules, I had passed the written qualification that covers search and rescue protocols, wildfire response, visitor contact procedures, and the federal statutes governing resource protection in national park units. I had done all of it from a desk in Sacramento in the 12 weeks before my assignment was finalized, and I had felt prepared. The list of rules arrived on a Tuesday, 8 days before I was scheduled to drive up. It came as a printed addendum to my orientation packet, not digital, which I noticed, because everything else in the packet had been a PDF. This was paper, folded once, tucked inside the back cover of the binder. It looked like it had been photocopied from something older. The font was not the Park Service font I had seen on every other document. It was a narrower typeface, the kind older typewriters used to produce, and the paper had the dry, slightly yellowed quality of something that had been copied from a copy over enough decades that the original no longer mattered. The heading read, Supplemental Conduct Guidelines, Yosemite North Sector Patrol. Below that is a numbered list, 14 items. I read them once, quickly, and then sat with them for a long time, because I could not make them cohere. They were specific in the way that real rules are specific, not theoretical, not hedged with qualifiers, but the specificity didn't point anywhere I could follow. Rules about walking speed, rules about what to do if you see your own shadow in a certain kind of light. A rule about not counting things out loud. A rule about what to do, and what absolutely not to do if you hear your name spoken in an area you know, to be empty of other people. I called the district office. I was told someone would get back to me. No one did. I drove up on a Thursday in October with the list folded in the same pocket of my bag where I had put it the day it arrived. I had assumed that arriving would explain it, that there would be someone, a senior ranger, a field supervisor, a posted notice that would decode the addendum into something procedural and sensible, that the strangeness of it was a function of my distance from context, not a property of the rules themselves. That assumption did not survive the first week. The North Sector station is a single-story structure in a clearing off a fire road, about 4 miles from the valley floor. From the access road it looks small, which it is, but it also looks temporary, in a way that turns out not to be true. It has been in that clearing since 1971, which I learned from a laminated timeline on the wall above the coffee maker. The walls are wood panels. There is a radio unit bolted to a desk that faces the door. There are 2 bunks in a back room separated by a curtain. There is a bathroom. There is a small kitchen area with a 2-burner propane stove and a deep freezer that rattles when it cycles. There was a woman named Carol already there when I arrived. She had been at the station for 3 weeks and was completing a 6-week rotation. She was from the Shasta district originally, had requested Yosemite twice before and been turned down, and had finally gotten the assignment through a lateral transfer she'd been waiting 14 months for. She was in her mid-40s, physically compact, efficient in her movements, and almost entirely without small talk. She showed me where things were kept. She explained the radio protocols and the patrol schedule. She told me where the nearest cell signal was a specific bend in the access road. about 1.5 miles from the station, and she said it plainly, like a piece of practical information, not an apology. On the second nick, HE, I asked her about the list. She was at the desk with a field report in front of he, and she didn't look up immediately when I put the paper on the table beside her. She looked at it for a moment and then pushed it back towards me. "Did you read it?" she said. "Yes." "All of it?" "Yes." She nodded once, like she was confirming something she already knew. Then she went back to the report. "Carol, follow them," she said. "That's not I'm asking you to explain them." "I know what you're asking." She set down the pen she'd been holding. She looked at me directly for the first time since I'd put the paper down. Her expression was not impatient, and it was not nervous. It was careful, in the way a person is careful when they are choosing what not to say rather than what to say. "I don't explain them, I follow them. You should follow them. That's the only thing I can tell you that's useful." "Have you had anything happen that made them make sense?" She looked at me for another 2 or 3 seconds. Then she picked up the pen again. "Get some sleep," she said. "First patrol goes at 6. I took the list back and read it again in my bunk. "I'm going to describe all 14 rules because I think you need the full picture to understand what came after. Here is what they said, as closely as I can reproduce them from memory, because I no longer have the physical paper. 1. When walking any patrol route in the North Sector, maintain a pace that allows you to hear your own footsteps clearly. Do not move fast enough that the sound of your own steps becomes continuous rather than distinct. 2. If you observe another person at a distance in an area that your patrol records indicate should be unoccupied, do not call out to them. Alter your route to approach from a direction that does not require them to turn to face you. 3. Never count objects, steps, animals, or features out loud. Counting is permitted silently. 4. If visibility drops below 40 feet due to fog or smoke, reduce your patrol radius and do not advance past any tree line you cannot see the continuation of. 5. Do not speak in declarative sentences about your own location. Avoid statements of the form, "I am at place," or "I am standing at landmark." Use relative language, "I'm near," "I'm close to," "I came from." 6. If you hear your name spoken in an area you have confirmed is unoccupied by other personnel, stop walking. Do not respond. Wait until you have heard 3 identifiably ambient sounds, wind, water, birdsong, or similar before resuming movement. 7. Do not enter any structure, natural or man-made, that you have not previously entered during daylight, after 7 p.m. 8. If you find a personal item, clothing, equipment, food, or any manufactured object that does not appear in any visitor record for the current period, photograph it and mark its location. Do not move it. Do not touch it with bare skin. 9. If you see your own shadow at an angle inconsistent with the position of the sun, stop and take a compass bearing before moving. Verify your orientation before continuing. 10. Do not use the phrase "follow me" or "come with me" when communicating with any person you encounter in the backcountry, even if that person appears to be a visitor in need of assistance. Use directional language instead. The station is north. The trail continues left. 11. If an animal approaches you without apparent fear and maintains eye contact for longer than you are comfortable with, do not attempt to shoo it or move away from it quickly. Maintain your position. Look past the animal rather than at it. Wait for it to leave. 12. Do not take photographs after sunset in any area north of the Fire Road junction. 13. When filing daily reports, do not describe unusual perceptual experiences in categorical terms. Do not write, "I heard a voice," or "I saw a figure." Use observational language only, an auditory event, a visual disturbance. The distinction matters for the integrity of the official record. 14. If any situation arises that the preceding rules do not cover, apply the logic of the nearest applicable rule. Do not improvise. Improvisation in ambiguous situations is the primary source of incidents in this sector. I followed them. I followed them from the first patrol, not because I understood them, but because Carol had told me to, and because the specificity of them suggested an author who had reasons, even if those reasons were not included. I've had enough experience with institutional rules, park service, prior employment, federal protocol to know that specificity is the residue of prior events. Nobody writes a rule that granular without having needed it. Whatever needed it meant in this context, I was willing to assume the rule preceded me for a reason. The North Sector patrols are long. A full circuit is between 9 and 11 miles, depending on the route, crossing 3 distinct ecological zones: the lower mixed forest, the upper subalpine meadow corridor, and the exposed granite band near the northern ridgeline. In October, the daylight window is roughly 11 hours. Carol and I alternated the full circuit daily with the off day assigned to station maintenance, radio monitoring, and short radius checks within a mile of the station. The first 6 days were without incident. October in the North Sector is cold and clear and almost empty of visitors. The crowds that fill the valley floor in summer are gone. The permit holders who backpack the high country trails have largely finished their season. What remains is landscape, and the sounds that landscape makes when people are not inside it. I want to describe the silence carefully because it matters to what came after. It is not a simple silence. Yosemite at elevation in October is quite the way. A large space is quiet with its own acoustics, its own ambient register. Water is moving in the creeks below the meadows. Wind through the upper granite, the specific sound of pine needles in cold air, which is different from pine needles in warm air in a way I could not have articulated before, but can now. The silence is full. It has texture. You stop noticing it in the way that you stop noticing your own breathing, and then something changes in it, and you notice it again, and the noticing arrives before you can identify what changed. On day 7 I noticed something. It was mid-morning, about 4 miles into the full circuit, in the transition zone between the lower mixed forest and the upper meadow. I was walking at the pace described in Rule 1, deliberate enough that each footstep was a distinct sound, heel and toe, the rhythm of it constant and audible. The trail through this section runs through a loose grove of whitebark pine, and the trees are spaced widely enough that visibility is good for 50 to 60 feet in most directions. I was moving north-northeast when I became aware of a second rhythm. It was almost exactly synchronized with mine. Almost, but not quite. Off by a fraction, not an echo, because an echo would have been behind me and delayed in a way I could have identified as sound bouncing off something. This was lateral. To my right, somewhere in the tree line, moving at a pace that matched mine, near enough that the mismatch was only noticeable when I was paying close attention. I slowed down. The second rhythm slowed. I stopped. The second rhythm did not stop for approximately 2 additional footfalls, and then it stopped. I stood still for a long time. I looked into the trees without moving my head quickly. I could see approximately 40 feet in the direction the sound had come from. There was nothing visible that was not a tree or the shadow of a tree. The wind had died and the morning was very still, and the silence that followed the cessation of both sets of footsteps was the kind of silence that seems to have physical pressure. After perhaps 4 minutes as I resumed walking, Rule 1, the pace at which footsteps are distinct. The second rhythm did not resume. I completed the circuit and filed my daily report. Per Rule 13, I wrote, auditory event in the upper transition zone, approximately mile 4.2 of the circuit, ambient, no visitor contact. And I moved on with my day, which is to say, I made coffee and sat with the feeling of it and tried to locate it in a register I understood. I did not tell Carol for 2 days. This is something I want to be precise about because my reason for not telling her was not embarrassment, and it was not uncertainty about what I'd heard. I did not tell her because I was not sure yet whether telling her would mean that she would tell me something I was not ready to hear. There was a version of that conversation in which she nodded and confirmed it, and handed me a context that made the rules make complete sense, and I was not sure I wanted that version yet. Once something has been confirmed, you can't unknow it. You can't return to the position of having heard something ambiguous in the woods and wondering what it was. On the 9th day, in a different section of the circuit, the exposed ridge approach, 1.5 miles from the upper meadow, I saw the shadow. The sky was clear. The sun was behind me and to the left, which at that latitude and that time of morning meant my shadow should have been falling forward and to the right. It was doing that. I could see it ahead of me on the pale granite, elongated by the low angle of October light, correctly proportioned, moving correctly with my stride. I saw a second shadow. It was to my left and slightly ahead of my own. It had the proportions of a person upright, 2-legged, the correct rough silhouette of a bipedal figure. It was moving in the same direction I was moving. It was not moving at the same pace as my shadow. It was slightly faster, as though the person casting it was walking a half step ahead of me. I stopped. My shadow stopped. Rule 9 was in my mind before I consciously retrieved it. I took the compass from my belt and took a bearing. The bearing was correct. My orientation was exactly what it should have been. I was standing where I thought I was standing, facing the direction I thought I was facing, with the sun precisely where it should have been. There was no physical explanation for the second shadow. I looked left. There was nothing in the direction the shadow should have been coming from. Open granite, a scatter of low-growing alpine shrubs, the ridgeline above, no person, no structure, nothing that would produce a shadow of that size and shape at that angle. I waited. Rule 6 had been written for sound, but the logic of it seemed applicable. I waited until I had heard 3 identifiably ambient sounds wind across the granite above me. A Clark's nutcracker in the trees below, the distant sound of water in the creek far down the slope, before I moved again. The second shadow did not reappear for the rest of that circuit. That evening I told Carol. She listened without interrupting. She did not change her expression in any way that I could read as surprise. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she asked me which rule I had used. 9, I said. And then the logic of 6, for the waiting. She nodded. That was correct, she said. What was it? I don't know. Has it happened to you? She looked at me steadily. I've had events. Yes. What kind? Different kinds. I don't think it matters what kind I had. I think what matters is that you applied the correct rule. Carol, if you've been out here 3 weeks and you've had events and you haven't told me, there's nothing to tell. Her voice was not unkind, it was simply flat in the way that flat voices are when someone has decided a particular door is not available. The rules work. Whatever they were written for, they work. I know that because I've tested their logic and nothing has escalated. If they stopped working, I would tell you immediately. They haven't stopped working. You tested their logic. Yes. How? She picked up the field report she had set down. I'm not going to describe that, she said. Get some sleep. The next 4 days were quiet. Not without events, I mean quiet in the sense that the events stayed within the boundaries of what the rules had, in some oblique way, prepared me for. Small things, the sound of footsteps that were not mine, twice more, each time ceasing when I ceased. A section of trail in the lower forest where my sense of scale felt wrong, where the trees seemed briefly, unmistakably farther apart than the physical space between them should have allowed, as though the light was behaving according to a different geometry. A moment near the creek at the low point of the circuit, where I had the clear and distinct physical sensation of being looked at from a direction where there was nothing that could be looking, and the sensation was precise enough that I could have pointed to an exact spot on the hillside above the creek and said, "There, that is where it is." I did not say it out loud. I was aware during each of these moments of the specific rules the moment seemed designed to test. I applied the rules. The events stayed at the level of unease and did not escalate. I want to describe what that discipline felt like, because I think it's the center of the story, and I think it's easy to misread it. It did not feel like comfort. Following the rules did not make me feel safe. It made me feel like I was behaving correctly inside a system I did not design, for reasons I had not been told, toward outcomes I could not predict. The rules were a set of learned responses to stimuli that someone before me had studied long enough to systematize, and my compliance with them meant that whatever had generated the rules was, so far, responding to my compliance in the way the rules predicted. That was not safe. That was something more like a negotiation conducted in a language I had learned phonetically without understanding the grammar. On the 14th day, I broke a rule. I want to be clear about the conditions under which this happened, because I don't want you to think it was careless or impulsive. I broke the rule because I was trying to help someone, and the thing I want you to hold is that my intention made no difference to the outcome whatsoever. I was on the full circuit in the lower mixed forest section, just past mile 3 in the early afternoon. The light through the canopy was good. Visibility was 60 feet or better in all directions. I was following the pace of Rule 1, footsteps distinct, moving north on the designated trail. I heard a child crying. Not a sound from a child, an actual child, audibly distressed. The specific tonality of a child under 8 years old who is frightened rather than hurt, which is a distinction that becomes instinctive with any outdoor work involving the public. The sound was coming from the east, off the trail, somewhere in the forest below the trail, perhaps 100 feet. The trees were dense enough that I couldn't see the source. Rule 4 was not in play, visibility was good, and I could see the continuation of the tree line. Rule 7 was not in play, it was early afternoon. No rule addressed the sound of a distressed child. Except there was. Rule 14. If any situation arises that the preceding rules do not cover, apply the logic of the nearest applicable rule. Do not improvise. The nearest applicable rule was Rule 2. which addresses approaching an unidentifiable person in an unoccupied area from a direction that does not require them to turn to face you. The logic of Rule 2, extrapolated. Do not approach a source you cannot yet see by moving toward it directly. Approach obliquely. Don't call out. I did not apply that logic. I broke Rule 10, instead the rule about not saying follow me or come with me, by calling out before I had visual contact. Hello, I'm a ranger. I'm going to come towards you. Can you hear me? I said exactly that. I know I said it because the moment the words left my mouth, I felt the wrongness of them as a physical sensation in my chest. Not anxiety, not fear wrongness, the specific and completely distinct feeling of having made a categorical error. The crying stopped immediately. Not the way a child stops crying when they hear an adult voice and feel relief that cessation is gradual. The sound decompressing. This was immediate, simultaneously with the end of my sentence, as though a switch had been thrown. I stood still. The forest was silent in a way it had not been before I spoke. The ambient register I had described earlier, the texture of the silence was gone. There was no wind in the canopy, no bird song, no water sound from below. The silence that replaced the crying was not the full silence of the forest. It was an emptied silence, a silence that had been recently occupied by something that had now removed itself, the acoustic equivalent of a room someone just left. I stood for a very long time. I counted ambient sounds as Rule 6 directed. They did not come. I waited past what the rules specified. I waited for perhaps 15 minutes. Nothing. No wind, no birds, no water. The forest was silent in a direction I could not point to on a compass. I completed the circuit. The ambient sounds returned gradually over the following 2 miles. Birdsong first, then water sound, then wind re-entering the acoustic register the way blood returns to a limb incrementally, without drama, but unmistakably. By the time I reached the station, the world sounded normal. I filed the report per Rule 13. Auditory event in the lower mixed forest, approximately mile 3.2. Ambient sounds ceased. Resumed approximately mile 5.4. No visitor contact. What I wrote was accurate. What I did not write was the rule violation, because Rule 13 addressed how to describe events, not whether to report your own infractions. I told myself this was because there was no guidance for self-reporting, and therefore no applicable rule. I know now that I was wrong. The reason I didn't write it was that I was afraid of what it would look like in my own handwriting. Carol was not at the station when I returned. She was on the short radius check. When she came back, I told her what had happened. I told her all of it, including what I'd said and when. She was quiet for longer than usual. She set down the equipment she'd come back with and stood at the kitchen counter with her back to me for a moment. Then she turned around. "You said come towards you," she said. Yes, in a declarative form. Yes. Rule 5. Do not speak in declarative sentences about your own location. The rule specified location, not movement, but the logic extended. Stating your intended movement toward a source you cannot see is, functionally, a declaration of where you will be. Nothing followed me back, I said. Whatever it was, it stopped when I stopped. You don't know that, she said. Her voice was still even. You know it stopped making sound. That isn't the same thing. She didn't say anything else that night. She made food. We ate. The station was quiet in the ordinary way stations are quiet. I checked the perimeter, which was part of the nightly routine. walking the 100-foot radius around the structure in both directions. Nothing abnormal. The October sky was very clear. The stars at that elevation were dense in a way that always reminded me of how small the artificial light we build really is. I went to my bunk. I lay in the dark for a long time. I was not afraid in the spike of adrenaline sense. I was afraid in the way you are afraid when you have done something you cannot undo and cannot yet see the full consequence of the waiting fear, the fear that is its own sustained weather rather than an event. The next 3 days, I followed the rules with a precision I had not applied before. Not the practiced compliance of the first weeks, but the following, because I was told to. The precision of someone who has now understood, viscerally rather than intellectually, what the rules are for. The rules were not arbitrary. They were not bureaucratic overcaution. They were the residue of someone's direct experience, possibly several someone's, across years or decades with a set of phenomena that behaved consistently enough to be mapped. The rules were a map. I had been walking on the map without reading it as a map, and on the 14th day I had stepped off it. I did not hear the crying again. I want to note that clearly because in hindsight I think its absence was as significant as its presence had been. Whatever had been producing it or whatever had been using it, which is the word my mind kept returning to despite my resistance to it, had stopped. Not pulled back temporarily, stopped, as though my rule violation had closed something rather than opened it, or as though the conversation I'd begun by speaking had been concluded on terms I wasn't tracking. Carol completed her rotation on day 21 of my time at the station. She left on a Wednesday morning. She had her gear loaded before I was awake, which I think was intentional. We had coffee together while it was still dark, and she gave me the patrol log, the station inventory, and the radio code she had updated during her rotation. Before she left, I asked her one more question. "The rules," I said. "Do you know who wrote them?" She picked up her keys. She stood at the door for a moment with her back to me. "No," she said. "I don't know who wrote the original. I know some of them have been added over the years. The original set was 5, I think. Maybe 6. I don't know who added the rest. I don't know if the people who added them are still working. Still working here? Or still working?" She opened the door. The cold October air came in, clean and carrying pine resin. "Drive safe," I said. She left. I stood at the station door and watched her truck move down the fire road until the trees took it. Then I was alone in the North Sector, 3 weeks into a 6-week rotation, with the rules and a radio and 11 miles of trail, and whatever the trail contained. The 2 weeks following Carol's departure were the longest of my life. I want to be careful here about melodrama because the things that happened during those 2 weeks were not, individually, extreme. They were not violent. No one was hurt. Nothing materialized out of the air in front of me. There were no voices in the dark, no figures at the window, none of the set-piece moments of the genre. What happened was subtler and more corrosive than any of that, and I think the reason it was more corrosive is precisely because of its restraint. The phenomena, I'm going to use that word, because it's the only one that covers the full range without importing explanation. The phenomena became more frequent after I was alone. Not dramatically so. 1 per day, approximately. Always within the patrol route, always fitting into the behavioral grammar of the rules, and as though whoever or whatever was generating them was itself constrained by the same logic the rules described. The footstep rhythm appeared 4 more times, each time beginning when I began, syncopated with mine at first and gradually less so, ceasing when I ceased. The interval between my stopping and the cessation of the second rhythm changed. In the early occurrences it had been 2 footfalls brief, as though whatever it was took a moment to register my stop. In the final occurrences of my rotation, the lag had closed to 0. It stopped when I stopped. The synchronization was perfect. I tried not to assign meaning to that. Tried and did not succeed. The shadow appeared twice more, both times on the ridge approach, both times in the same relative position, slightly ahead, slightly left, moving in the same direction I was moving. The first time I applied Rule 9 exactly as before, I took the compass bearing, confirmed my orientation, and waited for the 3 ambient sounds. The shadow was gone when I looked up. The second time I applied the same rule. The shadow was not gone when I looked up. It was gone approximately 30 seconds later, after I had held my position and looked at the compass, rather than at the shadow. When I raised my eyes again, the granite was unmarked. The animal rule, Rule 11. I had not needed until the 18th day of my rotation. On the 18th day I encountered a raven. Ravens are not unusual in the North Sector. They are among the most common large birds in that elevation range, and their behavior around human presence is well documented. They're intelligent, opportunistic, and habituated to rangers in a way that smaller birds are not. A raven approaching a ranger is not anomalous. This raven landed on a granite outcrop approximately 8 feet from where I was standing, and made no sound. It stood on the rock and looked at me. Not the lateral curious look of a bird assessing whether you have food. A direct look. Both eyes forward, the way a raven looks when it is interested in something that is not food. I maintained my position. I looked past the bird, not at it, as Rule 11 directed. The raven did not move. I could see it in my peripheral vision, a sharp-edged black shape against the pale granite, absolutely still. The stillness of it was the wrong kind of stillness, not the stillness of an animal resting, the stillness of something that is paying attention. I counted ambient sounds silently. Wind, water in the creek below, a white-crowned sparrow somewhere in the shrubs to my north. I moved. The raven turned its head to track me as I walked. When I was 20 feet past the outcrop, I heard it take off the heavy wing beat of a large corvid, 3 or 4 strokes, then silent. I did not look back. Rule 11 had said to wait for the animal to leave of its own accord, which it had done. I had followed the rule. The rule had worked in the sense that the event had concluded. What the rule had not addressed, and what I could not locate a precedent for in the other 13 rules, was what to do about the fact that the raven landed again 40 yards ahead of me on the trail, and repeated the process. 3 times it landed ahead of me on that circuit, each time directly on the trail, each time with the same forward-focused stillness. Each time I applied Rule 11. Each time it eventually departed. On the 3rd landing, it was on the granite a few feet before the trail turned down toward the lower forest. And after it left, I stood at the turn for a long moment, looking at the upper ridge, where the trail did not go. I did not go up the ridge. There was no trail there, and the rules did not cover improvised route deviation. Rule 14 directed me to apply the logic of the nearest applicable rule rather than improvise. The nearest applicable rule for an unmarked route was Rule 7. Do not enter any structure you haven't previously entered during daylight, extended to space rather than structure. I had not been on the upper ridge during daylight. It was not yet dark, but the logic held. I took the turn and continued the circuit. On the 22nd day, 6 days before the end of my rotation, I had the clearest event of the entire period. It was morning, just after first light, during what should have been a short radius check, a mile radius walk around the station, which I had been doing as part of the daily routine. I was perhaps a half-mile from the station, in the lower edge of the mixed forest, when I became aware, not through any single sensory input, but through some integration of all of them together, that something was standing between two trees approximately 30 feet away. I could not see it clearly. The light in the forest at that hour is complicated, the low sun throwing long shadows between the trunks, the spaces between the trees alternately bright and very dark. What I perceived in the shadow between two large pines was not a shape I could describe to you with confidence. It was not humanoid in the way the second shadow on the ridge had been humanoid. It was not an animal in any way I recognized. What I can tell you with confidence is that it was present, that there was something in that space that had physical presence, that occupied the volume of air between those two trees in a way that displaced the light differently than empty air displaces it. It did not move. I applied the rules in sequence, thinking through them the way you run a checklist when your hands are not free. Rule 6. For the name thing not applicable, no name had been spoken. Rule 2. For unidentified persons at a distance, the logic of it applied even if this was not a person, because the underlying principle was, don't force a confrontation by your approach. I had not been walking toward it. I had stopped when I noticed it. Rule 11. For the animal, maintain position. Look past it. Wait for it to leave. I looked past it. I looked at the tree behind it, and to the right, a lodgepole with a broken upper branch that was visible against the sky. I looked at that tree, and I regulated my breathing. Gianai was still. It was still. The 4 minutes I waited in that position were the most viscerally uncomfortable 4 minutes I have ever spent. Not because of what was in those shadows, because of the absolute coherence of the experience, which is harder to discount than incoherence would have been. If what I was seeing had flickered or wavered, or behaved in the way that optical illusions and perceptual tricks behave inconsistently, dissolving when you hold still, it would have been easier to file it away. What I saw did not do that. It was there with the same solidity and constancy that a tree is there. It was there the way real things are there, which is to say, without requiring my belief to occupy space. After 4 minutes, it was gone. I could not tell you when it left or in which direction. It was simply present. And then it was not present, and the space between the trees was empty, and the light through the forest was the same ordinary, complicated October morning light. I walked back to the station. I made coffee. I sat at the desk for a long time without touching it. I did not file this in the daily report. Rule 13 told me how to describe it. A visual disturbance in the lower mixed forest. But I did not file it. I sat with it instead, which was its own kind of violation. The rules had a logic, and the logic of Rule 13 implied that filing the report was the correct response to any event, because the alternative to the observational language of the official record was the categorical language the rule warned against, and the rule warned against it for a reason. I understood the reason now, in a way I had not understood it on the day the list arrived. The reason was not bureaucratic. The reason was that categorical language, I saw a figure, I heard a voice, is a claim about what a thing is. Observational language, a visual disturbance, an auditory event, is a record of what happened without a claim about the source. The rules were not asking me to lie in my reports. They were asking me not to name what I was seeing in terms that assumed I understood it, because the assumption of understanding was what led to improvisation. And Rule 14 was unambiguous. Improvisation in ambiguous situations is the primary source of incidents. I filed the report the next morning. Visual disturbance in lower forest, short radius check, morning, duration approximately 4 minutes, no visitor contact. On the 25th day, I found the item that Rule 8 addressed. It was a jacket, a child's jacket, bright yellow, the kind with a hood and ribbed cuffs, the kind that children wear in autumn in the East and the Midwest, and where parents buy for colour visibility. It was hanging on a branch at the lower edge of the mixed forest, approximately 30 feet from the trail, hung carefully as though placed there rather than lost or blown there. Both arms of it were hanging down. The hood was up. There were no visitors logged in the north sector for the preceding 7 days. No permits, no access records. The jacket had not been there on my most recent circuit of that section, which had been 2 days earlier. I photographed it from the trail. I marked the GPS coordinates and the approximate bearing from the trail junction. I did not move it. I did not touch it. Rule 8 applied completely. What Rule 8 did not address, and this is the part I have returned to more times than any other moment of the rotation, was how to look at a child's jacket hung carefully on a branch in an empty sector and not ask the question that a jacket hung carefully on a branch in an empty sector demands you ask. I asked the question silently, to myself, walking back to the trail. The answer I arrived at, after 2 days of living with it, was the one I did not want. Not because the answer was certain. I have no way to make it certain, and I think certainty is probably not available to me or to anyone in this context, but because the answer that fit the available evidence, the answer that the rules seem to have been written around, the answer implied by the specificity of Rule 8's prohibition against touching any found item with bare skin, that answer was not about children being careless with their clothing in the forest. The jacket was gone 2 days later when I passed the site again. I photographed the empty branch. I updated the location marker. The investigation of found items in national park units follows a different protocol than the one I was operating under, and I submitted the photographs and coordinates to the district office in my final weekly summary. I have not received a response. My rotation ended on a Friday in late November. The ranger who was replacing me arrived on Thursday evening, which gave us 1 night of overlap. He was young, mid-20s. This was his 3rd rotation in the Park Service, but his 1st in the North Sector. He had his gear in order, and his questions read, "Ian, the practiced competence of someone good at learning new environments." I gave him the patrol log, the station inventory, and the updated radio codes. I told him about the footstep rhythm and the raven and the jacket on the branch. I described the visual disturbance. I told him about my rule violation on the 14th day, what I had said and what had happened when I said it, and I told him this clearly and without softening it, because I thought he needed to know precisely what the consequence of violating Rule 10 had been, and what it had felt like in the moment before the consequence became visible. He listened carefully. He took notes. He did not look skeptical, which I appreciated. Then I gave him the list. He took it and read it once, and then looked up at me with the same expression I imagined I had worn when I first read it, the expression of someone trying to find the coherent institutional framework that explains a set of rules that don't cohere. "Follow them," I said. I drove down the fire road in the dark. The station's light was the last thing visible in my rear-view mirror before the trees closed behind me. I reached the bend in the road where the cell signal begins, and my phone lit up with the notifications from 6 weeks of near silence, messages, emails, the algorithmic pulse of things that had been accumulating without me. And I sat in the car in the dark at the bend in the road for a long time before I drove on. I have been back in Sacramento for 4 months. I returned to the desk and the training modules and the procedural rhythms of a job that is familiar and well lit and full of other people. My colleagues ask how the rotation was, and I say it was good, which is not a lie but is not an answer. My supervisor reviewed my patrol logs and the weekly summaries and commented that my documentation was precise and consistent, which I took as confirmation that I had followed Rule 13 correctly. I requested a copy of the supplemental conduct guidelines for my personnel file. I was told there was no such document on record. I know the list was real. I carried it for 43 days. I read it until I had all 14 rules in memory. I filed reports that were shaped by its logic, reports that are in the official record right now under my name and my ranger identification number. The list existed. The fact that it cannot be located in the filing system is not evidence that it didn't exist. It is evidence of something else, which is that the people who maintain the filing system either do not know it exists or have decided it should not be locatable. I cannot determine which, and Rule 14 extrapolated to my current situation tells me that the distinction may not matter. What I carry from the rotation is not a feeling of dread exactly, and it is not the enrolled vigilance of someone who has been absorbed into a system. It is something more like the adjustment that happens when you have been in a large, dark space for a long time and then return to ordinary light. Not blindness, not damage, a recalibration of what ordinary means, and a persistent awareness that the calibration has shifted. I walk differently now, deliberately, with audible footsteps, the pace of Rule 1 even on sidewalks, even in Sacramento, even in the office. I do not make declarations about my own location. I do not count things out loud. I have not done these things since November, and I do not know if I will stop. I do not know if the rules apply here. I do not know if the rules have a geographic boundary or whether I walked out of the North Sector believing I was walking out of their jurisdiction. On 3 separate occasions since returning, I have heard a rhythm while walking that was almost synchronized with mine. Once in a parking structure, once on a residential street near my apartment at night. Once in the building where I work, in a hallway, and when no one else was present. Each time I stopped, each time the second rhythm stopped approximately 1 beat after mine. The interval has not closed to 0 here, the way it did in the final days of my rotation. It is still 2 beats behind, still 2 footfalls of lag. I have tried to interpret the persistence of the lag as a meaningful distinction from what the patrol route had produced by the end. In the North Sector, the synchronization became perfect. Here, there is still a gap. 2 beats, as though whatever it is has had to teach me again from the beginning, or as though the version of it that followed me back is less practiced than the version that spent 43 days walking the same 11 miles of trail, or the gap is closing. I count ambient sounds when I stop. I wait until I have heard 3. Here in the city, the sounds are different to traffic, HVAC systems, voices from other rooms, but the principle of the rule does not specify what counts as ambient. The principle is, wait until you are reoriented by the sounds of the world before you move again. I wait. The world offers its sounds. I move. I have not improvised. I have not applied categorical language to any of it in any document or report. I have not named what was in the shadows between those two trees, or what walked beside me on the trail, or what hung a yellow jacket on a branch in an empty sector of a federal wilderness, and then removed it, without record. The rules say not to name it. I don't think the rules say that to protect me from knowing. I think they say it because naming implies a claim about the nature of the thing, and the claim invites a response. And whoever wrote the rules understood the nature of that response well enough to prohibit the invitation. I still have the compass. I still carry it here in Sacramento, the same one I carried on the patrol route. I have not needed to use it to verify my orientation in a city I have lived in for 6 years. I carry it because Rule 9 does not specify a geography, and because there have been 2 mornings on the walk from my apartment to the parking garage when my shadow has behaved in a way that I could not immediately explain. Both times I stopped. Both times I took the compass bearing. Both times the bearing confirmed I was oriented correctly. The shadow, both times, resolved into an ordinary shadow once I confirmed the bearing. I am following the rules. I have not broken a rule since the 14th day of my rotation, 4.5 months ago. Whatever was in the North Sector, whatever the rules were written to manage, has not escalated. The phenomena continue at a low, steady level, present enough to be noticed, not acute enough to require anything beyond the rule I already have. 2 beats behind, not closing, not yet. I know some of you are going to look for the North Sector station. I know some of you are going to drive up there. I want to be precise about what I'm asking of you, because I'm not asking you not to go. I'm asking you to take the rules with you if you do. I don't have the original document. It cannot be found through the district office as I've described. What I have is memory, and I have given you as much of it as I can retrieve accurately. 14 rules. The logic of each one is recoverable if you understand that they are not protective instructions in the way safety guidelines are protective instructions. They are not warnings. They are behavioral protocols for an ongoing negotiation with something that pays attention to behavior. The thing that pays attention to behavior is, so far as I can determine, consistent. It responds the same way to the same inputs across multiple ranges over what I believe is a significant span of time. It is not random. It is not chaotic. It can be managed, which is different from saying it can be defeated, avoided, or denied. You cannot avoid it in the North Sector. The rules are not avoidance instructions, they are engagement instructions. Follow them. Walk at a pace where you can hear your own footsteps, each one distinct. Don't count out loud. Don't announce your location. Don't approach something you cannot see by moving directly towards it. If you hear your name, wait for 3 ambient sounds before you move again. Don't touch found objects with your bare skin. Don't take photographs after dark in the northern range. Don't say, "Follow me." And if you encounter something that the rules don't cover, and you will, because whatever wrote the phenomena didn't use the same author as whoever wrote the rules, and the coverage is incomplete, apply the logic of the nearest rule. Think about what principle underlies it. Apply that. Do not improvise. I would tell you the Yellow Jacket story differently if I could. I would tell it in a way that lets me set it down. But the honest version of it is the one I've given you, which is that I photographed it and marked it and kept walking and followed the rules, and it was gone 2 days later. And I reported its presence and its absence to the district office, and received no response, and I do not know what it means, and the rules have no entry for it beyond Rule 8, which addresses finding and not understanding. I found it. I did not understand it. I did not touch it. I kept walking. That is the grammar of this place, and I am still speaking it, even here, even now, even 4 months after I drove off the fire road and the station's light went out behind the trees. The compass is in my jacket pocket, the bearing is steady. The shadow this morning fell where it should, 2 beats behind,